Hello and welcome to the Charles J. McClung Public Speaking Contest. The contest is sponsored by the School of Communication Studies, led by Dr. John W. Haas. You might recognize his name because he is the author of your textbook. Dr. Haas teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in organizational communication, interpersonal communication, and research methods. He recently became the executive director of the Southern States Communication Association and has published numerous scholarly articles and books. Dr. Haas is ably assisted by Sandy Cabbage, who is the program resource specialist in the School of Communication Studies. We're very thankful for the help she gives us also with the contest. The McClung Speech Contest has been a long-standing tradition in the School of Communication Studies and is the largest contest of its kind in the southeastern United States. The McClung Contest is an opportunity for undergraduates, generally first and second year students, to shine by delivering their speeches to hundreds of students currently taking Com Studies 210. Normally, the contest would be held in the Cox Auditorium of the Alumni Memorial Building, but because of COVID restrictions, that is not possible this year. But we didn't want to let a pandemic stop us, so this year the contest will be virtual. If you're wondering who's talking to you, I am Jill Stapleton Bergeron, and I am the coordinator of the contest. This is my 16th year teaching Com Studies 210 at UT, and I've been the coordinator of the contest since 2017. On the night of the preliminary round, I was assisted by Megan Fields, who formerly was a coordinator of the contest and an instructor of Com Studies 210. She now holds the position of Director of Public Speaking in the School of Communication Studies. Thanks to Megan for helping out. Each Com Studies instructor nominates one student from each section to participate in the contest by submitting their preparation outline. From those outlines, about 10 to 12 of the most outstanding are chosen for the second round, in which those students present their speeches to a panel of judges. The judges then select the 5 finalists who will present their speeches at the contest. This year, these 5 finalists will be doing their speeches on video here for you. Your instructor will give you a link that you can use to vote for your favorite. Voting closes Friday at midnight. The preliminary round of the contest this year was judged by Kaylin Mead, Mark Prather, and Lily Tillman. So without further ado, let's get to the speeches. You will watch the 5 finalist speeches and then go to a Google form to vote for who you think did the best job. Our first speaker tonight is Lily Duffy. She comes to UT from Greenville, South Carolina, and she's a freshman majoring in wildlife and fisheries science. She loves binge watching shows on the weekend, writing, and axe throwing. The title of her speech is Women's Education in Afghanistan.
Think about the last classroom you were in, whether you were a student, a guest, or an instructor. Were there women in that classroom? Chances are there likely were, but what if that weren't the case? In fact, what if saving a space for women's education meant this turned into this? That is an actual girls' school in Farah Province, Afghanistan that was bombed by the Taliban. Hi, I'm Lily Duffy, and today I'm going to be informing you all on women's education in Afghanistan. We're going to start by looking at the importance of women's education, then moving on to pre- and post-Taliban educational opportunities for women in Afghanistan, and finally, ending on current implications. Now, it's important to note here that the Taliban is a Deobandi Muslim extremist group, meaning that they are outliers in their own religion, and we should not base our opinion of all Muslims based on their extremist counterparts. Now, I'm sure the last thing we all thought about when we heard about what's happening in Afghanistan is what's happening with the people there. But it's very important for us to consider these things outside of our own realm of existence. We, in today's modern age, have become jaded to the world around us, and we shouldn't be. It's very important to not only think, but think critically about what's happening in the world around us. And I believe I'm a credible source to learn from because I've done weeks of research on this topic and have made sure that all my sources are scholarly. So let's begin by talking about the importance of women's education. In a 2004 article titled Reconstruction in Post-Taliban Afghanistan, Women in Education, Hayat Alvi notes that most Afghan teachers weren't women. And of course, in order to be an educator, one needs to be educated. In a February 2021 Social Sciences journal, Syed Hashimi notes that when women are educated, future generations will be as well. So if most teachers are women, women need to be educated, and women's education will bring about the education of future generations. It's so important for societies as a whole to invest in women's education. Now that we've talked about the importance of women's education, let's talk about some educational opportunities for women in Afghanistan pre-Taliban. Abdul-Nouri and Biagio's Special's 2016 article, Social Constraints of Women's Education, notes that when Afghanistan became an Islamic state in 1992, this signaled, quote, some slowdown in female emancipation. This might have been due to more conservative social customs or more conservative dress codes, but education opportunities stayed the same. Women were even allowed to go up to the university level, in fact. However, this took a turn in 1996 when the Taliban took Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. In a 2003 article titled The Taliban, Women and the Hijalian Private Sphere, Wangkul notes that women couldn't even wear white. Of course, given this pretty extreme social constraint, it's no wonder that women's education was swept under the rug. Going back to Nouri and Biagio's article, they noted that no school was allowed for women past age 8. That is the 3rd grade. Nouri and Biagio also did a survey in 2007 and 2008, which concluded that 84% of women surveyed had no formal schooling. This shows that this constraint on education left marks on society for ages to come. Now that we've talked about the importance of women's education, gone through pre- and post-Taliban educational opportunities for women, let's talk about modern implications. Now, as most of you have seen, the Taliban is back in power in Afghanistan. And given past trends, this can mean some pretty scary things for women's education. Syed Hashimi notes that not just terrorism itself, but the society it creates a hostile environment for women's education. There are 3 big pillars of this terroristic society. The first is war. Of course, with war draining resources, priorities need to be reevaluated. And with women's education not being on the Taliban's radar at all, it's no wonder that it was tossed aside. The next is cultural barriers. In any religious society, it's a lot easier for men to become powerful than women. And they use this to their advantage. In order to keep themselves in this position of power, they make sure that women don't have the same opportunities as them. And finally, religious misinterpretations. This is the backbone of why the Taliban doesn't believe women should be educated. It's not in their religion. It's not their interpretation. They don't believe in it. So, to conclude, let's review. Today we talked about the importance of women's education and how it is integral to not only education itself, but society. We looked at pre- and post-Taliban educational opportunities for women, from being able to go to university to not being able to go past 3rd grade, and finally, reasons for women's educational neglect under terrorism, being war, cultural barriers, and religious misinterpretation. So, the next time you hear about Afghanistan on the news, on TV, or online, I hope you realize that you're a little more informed now than you were yesterday, and take a moment to think, not just think, but think critically about what's happening in the world around us. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Emmeline Golden. She is a junior majoring in English. She comes to us from Lawrenceburg, Tennessee, and she loves reading, music, and video games. The name of her speech is How Magic Came to the Bayou.
All right, I'd like to start off with a quick question. Are there any fans of American Horror Story in the room? There we go. Well, hopefully after my speech today, you'll be inspired to take another look at Season 3, Coven, because today I want to tell you a little bit about New Orleans voodoo. Now, many of us are familiar with voodoo through shows like American Horror Story or movies like 1996's The Craft, but I wager that not many of us are familiar with its origins. I know I wasn't before I visited New Orleans in 2019 and took a look at the Voodoo Museum. I was absolutely captivated by this long historical practice. I picked up 3 books on it before I ever got home. So today, I want to share with you a little bit about what I learned about the history of voodoo and how it came to be in the United States. There are 3 elements that largely contributed to the formation of New Orleans voodoo. Traditional African religions that were brought over by slaves, Christianity, and a place called Congo Square. First, let's take a look at those traditional African religions. In the 1800s, there was a massive influx of slaves brought to the United States. One specific place where they often at least stopped it was New Orleans, Louisiana. Now, if you were a slave coming to the United States in the 1800s, you were going to be expected to convert to Christianity. An article published in the May 2019 edition of E-Tropic explains that what was commonplace and everyday in these traditional African religions that people held when they came over became weird and mystified in American culture. Despite this, Katrina Hazard-Donald explains in her book, Mojo Workin', that many people who came over refused to give up certain elements of their religion. So when they were asked to convert, it created an interesting blend. Let's take a look at what happened. So, when these slaves were asked to convert to Christianity, a 2018 article published by the Cambridge University Press explains that some elements of Christianity already resonated quite well with the religions people already practiced. In fact, some of the slaves who came over were already baptized. So, when they came over, they were told the essential elements on how to be a good Christian, and it was left at that. There was a lot of reasons why they didn't bother to go through a full conversion, including a language barrier, a high lack of literacy, and a lack of interest. There was really no need to go through a full conversion. So now we've got this interesting blend of traditional African religions and Christianity. With those mixed together, it created a seed, the seed of New Orleans voodoo. With a seed, it just needs a place to grow. That place is now known as Congo Square. If you're to visit New Orleans today, it's most likely that you're going to find yourself in Louis Armstrong Park at one point or another, as it's one of the most famous tourist destinations in Louisiana. Within the park, there's a little plot of land called Congo Square. An October 2019 article published in De Arte explains the role of Congo Square in the formation of voodoo. See, an unusual aspect of being a slave in the 1800s in New Orleans was that you actually got Sundays off. On those Sundays off, you had a few things you might want to do, like go grocery shopping or catch up with old friends. The problem being that gatherings of enslaved Africans were heavily regulated. It got to the point where there was really only one place that people could gather. Now, this place went through a lot of different names, including the Place Publique, or that area on the other side of town, but it eventually became known as Congo Square, named after the Republic of Congo back in Africa. One of the most famous people to gather in Congo Square was named Marie Laveau. That name might be familiar if you are an American Horror Story fan, as she's one of the main characters. Marie Laveau is known as the first voodoo queen of New Orleans. She was a very famous practitioner, and her meetings in Congo Square were one of the main reasons why it grew to be so large and well known. So, to recap, today we took a look at a little bit at the different elements that came together to form modern New Orleans voodoo. The traditional African religions brought over by slaves in the 1800s, Christianity, and Congo Square. I hope my speech today has inspired you that the next time you take a vacation,
travel on down to New Orleans. I highly recommend the Voodoo Museum, and I promise you, you'll learn something you didn't know. Thank you.
Nikki Higgins is our third speaker, and she comes to us from Algonquin, Illinois, and is a sophomore majoring in nursing. She loves to read, write, paint, and run. And the title of her speech is The Importance of Free Menstrual Products in Scotland.
I want you to imagine this. You're sitting in class, and all of a sudden something feels a little off. You stand up a little bit and kind of run your hand up the back of your pants, only to realize you started your period a week early. You quickly ask to be excused and go to the restroom, and you sit down on the toilet. You quickly rifle through your backpack looking for tampons or pads, something to help you stop your bleeding, only for you to realize that when you went to the store last weekend, you couldn't afford tampons, so you decided to go without them. You quickly wrap some toilet paper around your underwear and proceed back to class, hoping that you don't bleed through more than you already have. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the importance of free menstrual products in Scotland, and I'd like to begin by defining menstruation for anybody who may be confused. The word menstruation and period can be used interchangeably, and it refers to the process in which the lining of the uterus sheds once a month, resulting in moderate bleeding from the vagina. Furthermore, I'd like to note that collectively throughout this speech, I'm going to be referring to women in general. However, all women do not get their period, and not everyone who gets their period identifies as a woman. I believe that this is very important for all of you to know because, once again, this is a universal biological process that many women around the globe undergo. And furthermore, I'm credible to speak on this topic because I do and have experienced menstruation for many years now. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the three most important outcomes from the Free Period Product Bill passed in Scotland, which includes the promotion of women's rights, an increase in education and awareness on period poverty, as well as period health and the tackling of period poverty. So first I'm going to talk about how a woman's place has now been prioritized in Scotland through the passing of this bill. It is extremely evident in their healthcare system. According to the Free the Tampon movement, students who are forced to use menstrual products for longer than recommended are at an increased risk of diseases such as cervical cancer, toxic shock syndrome, and other severe reproductive diseases. This is extremely detrimental not only to physical well-being, but also the mental and emotional well-being of women everywhere. Furthermore, the passing of this bill has ended the myth that tampons are a luxury. The Free the Tampon movement uses a phenomenal analogy to note that pads and tampons are the equivalent of restocking toilet paper and soap in public restrooms. By keeping this myth, we're only deepening the disparity and the gap between women across the globe. Furthermore, the passing of this bill preserves the dignity of women everywhere. The word period can go from anywhere from taboo to a complete burden. I've been told on many occasions that it's inappropriate and disrespectful to discuss my own period. And by preserving the dignity of women everywhere, they don't feel the shame they need to go out and have the appropriate products to take care of themselves. So now that I've talked to you about how a woman's place has been prioritized in Scotland, I'm going to be talking to you about how it has opened an increase in education and awareness on period health. As I kind of noted before, there's a major stigma and negative connotation associated with the word menstruation and period. It wasn't even until, as noted by a 2020 NPR article, that until Parliament began discussing this bill that they even remotely began discussing substantial reproductive topics such as endometriosis, an extremely painful reproductive disease that affects 6.5 million women globally. Furthermore, Parliament had to consider something a little more general, such as something we may take for granted, the little trash cans in the stalls in the restroom. Something as simple as a hygienic way to dispose of your period products are neglected until this bill was introduced to Parliament. Furthermore, something I kind of touched on already, shame. In a 2020 article by the BBC, it notes that 71% of girls ages 14 to 21 have been embarrassed by period products, and this also impacts their physical health. You may be asking how their shame correlates to physical health. However, they may settle for a less substantial or healthy topic or option for them to use as a result of their period. And not only does this interrupt their physical well-being, but again, their emotional and mental well-being. It comes full circle here. So now that I've talked to you about the increase in education and awareness on period health, I'm going to talk to you about period poverty. Period poverty is the instance in which someone can afford, obtain, or access period products, and this opens a phenomenal discussion on global health and affordability. In a BBC article, it notes that €8, or about $9.25 a month, are used on period products. And while many of us are fortunate enough to be able to buy our own period products, others are struggling to decide whether or not they have access to clean water, where their food's going to be coming from, or where they're going to be sleeping for the night. This is, once again, a universal biological process. You don't get to decide when you want to opt out of your period. Furthermore, this bill has opened the discussion as to how relevant period poverty is. According to Plan International UK, 10% of girls cannot afford period products, 15% of girls struggle to afford period products, and 19% of girls opt for a cheaper alternative, which again, I already talked about the physical implications of. And stemming off of this, I'd like to note that period poverty is a lot more common than you think. So let's talk about my period. When I go to Target, I typically buy a box of tampons. They cost me about $6.89. Keeping in mind there's about 18 tampons in the box, and you need to change your tampon every 4 to 8 hours to protect your health. Well, sometimes I don't always feel comfortable using tampons, so I also have to buy pads, so that's an added expense on top of that. Furthermore, your period tends to fluctuate. Sometimes the amount of blood I'm losing is heavier in some cycles and lower in others, and I have to compensate by buying extra period products. And while I've noted that I'm very fortunate enough to have to not worry about how much I'm spending on my period products, many others do have to worry about that. So now that I've talked to you about the 3 important outcomes from the Free to the Period Product Bill, which includes the promotion of women's rights, an increase in education and awareness on period health, as well as the tackling of period poverty, I'd love to leave you with a quote by the bill's proposer, Labour Member of Parliament Monica Lennon. No woman should have to worry about where her next pad, tampon, or reusable is coming from. Thank you.
Our fourth speaker is Gracie Julian. She is a sophomore majoring in kinesiology. She comes from Clearwater, Florida, and loves rollerblading, hiking, traveling, and figure skating, and was very active in the marching and concert bands when she was in high school. The title of her speech is A Deathly Smog.
Many of you may not know that pollution is actually one of the biggest killers in the United Kingdom right now. I had no idea either, but it's crazy to think that it actually starts with us and what we use and do every day. Many of you may not have heard of the Great Smog of London, but can probably picture what has happened. You can think about smog, but you may not be knowledgeable about how this occurred and how it affected the London culture at the time. My name is Gracie Julian. I've been interested in this topic since I first saw it on our list. I've done research on the last couple of weeks, and I feel that I'm educated enough to inform you all about it. Today, I'll be talking about the basic information of the smog and how it affected the London culture. First, I will start and talk about when it occurred. The Great Smog occurred on December 5th of 1952. When you think of the word smog, it's exactly what you would think it would be. It's a type of fog that is mixed with smoke, and it presents a yellowish color, as demonstrated here. In a 2017 peer-reviewed article from Chess, there was 2 types of smog reported. There was photochemical smog, and then there was industrial smog. At the time, London was faced with industrial smog. Industrial smog is when smog reaches the air, and the air is then cooled. This contains anything from sulfur dioxide to nitrogen dioxide, and then to carbon monoxide. In a 2002 peer-reviewed article from the Environmental Health Perspectives, this smog resided in the London basin for about 4 days. It was actually known for most of the factory smoke, and it was a heavy, motionless layer that resided and it just sat in the air and was nothing but dusty fumes. Next, I'll be talking about how this pollution occurred. The Great Smog of London was due to some of the heavy pollutants that were presented in the air at the right time. Air pollution is known as any sort of fine particle in the air that affects your respiratory system. These things can be anywhere from smoke or to dust. Now that was the basic information of smog, I will be talking about how it affected the London culture. There were several effects, actually. In a 2017 peer-reviewed article from the American Journal of Nursing, many Londoners during this time actually kept warm by burning abundant and inexpensive fuel. It was known as high sulfur coal. Many of the Londoners would go inside and they would burn it in the fireplace, and it would actually rise through the chimney, and this is when it would cool with the weather that was outside. Electric trams were also being replaced now with diesel buses, so this was increasing more pollutants in the air. Now that these pollutants were trapped underneath this large air mass, most of the air became very lethal, and many Londoners had a hard time breathing. They were trying to wear masks during this time, but it wasn't always guaranteed for their safety. Just like today in COVID-19, we wear masks to protect ourselves from the virus, but we're not 100% guaranteed by just wearing a mask. Now that was some of the basic information of the smog, I will talk about how it affected the culture. The Great Smog of London had some immediate health effects on the Londoners during this time. Inhaling large amount of toxins is actually known to have weakness and harsh cough later. As presented here, there are two of these ladies breathing into what seems like handkerchiefs because it is so harsh on their lungs. In a 2006 magazine from Weatherwise, pollution affected a lot of individuals. These happen to be the very young, very old, the asthma sufferers, heavy smokers, and anyone with pre-existing heart and lung conditions. It was reported that on the first day, hundreds of people had died. They died from heart failure, suffocation, inflammation of airway, or even anywhere to pneumonia. Now I want to talk some about the long-term effects. It wasn't just health effects that actually occurred, there was more in it than that. It was more like politics too. In a 2006 magazine from Weatherwise, the British Parliament actually enacted a Clean Air Act, which controlled the domestic and industrial smoke zones. This is how we know as smoke zones today in different areas like airports. In a 2002 peer-reviewed article from Environmental Health Perspectives, 250,000 Londoners actually participated in the American Cancer Society research, and it was shown that those who were presented in the pollution at the time had a higher risk for lung cancer and cardiopulmonary mortality. In a 2017 peer-reviewed article from the American Journal of Nursing, many of those that were living during this time actually were presented with asthma development. It was those who were actually in utero and shortly born afterwards. In statistics, there was 20% of those that were diagnosed with asthma compared to 11% of those that were elsewhere in the world during this time that were presented with asthma. This is just a comparison of showing you those percentages of those that had asthma from the London event and those who were elsewhere. In closing, I hope you learned a little more about the Great Smog of London. Remember, I talked about the basic information and some of the ways that it affected the culture. Hopefully next time when you hear about smog in your county, you'll think about some of the things I had just said.
Our final speaker is James Owen. He is a junior, and he comes to us from Wichita, Kansas. He likes to analyze, criticize, and appreciate art, whether it's books, poetry, films, or video games. The title of his speech is, Yes, Even Your Favorite Shirt is Probably from a Sweatshop.
The USA abolished slavery in 1865, but if you know which threads to follow, you'll find that almost every article of clothing in this room today can be traced back to modern slavery. You may be wondering how human trafficking overseas has made its way into your closet, and there is no better place to start looking than the textile factories of Vietnam. About 6 weeks ago, I started my research on the economy and the labor conditions of Vietnam, and I would love to share my findings with you today. While human trafficking violations there are rampant, the developing countries' growing resources and prioritization of the issue show promise for the future. Today we'll explore human trafficking in general, Vietnam's particular struggles with human trafficking, before going on to the government's involvement in human trafficking, and then putting all of this into perspective before drawing some conclusions. So without further ado, let's begin. To paraphrase the UN's definition of human trafficking, it is when someone recruits, transports, or receives people in order to exploit them for profit. Human traffickers keep control over their victims in a number of ways, many of which involving force, although the most popular forms do not. For example, human traffickers might take advantage of those without better prospects by offering them opportunity and then keeping them in perpetual debt or charging them exorbitant job-finding fees. The suppression of unions is another way that employers might take a direct role in the abuses of their workers, and then keep power by threatening to fire anyone who tries to negotiate. So now that we have a better understanding of how human trafficking works and maybe what it looks like, we go on to Vietnam's particular struggles with human trafficking. A 2019 article by the Yi of Reuters News suggests that brands from the US and Europe put a lot of pressure on local factories. In fact, they use harsh negotiating tactics that undercompensate the workers there. These deals might be profitable for the brands, however, they can result in long work hours with forced extensions and denials of sick leave for the workers who keep production running. So while local factories can't afford to pay their people more, they stay in control again with threats against those who try to negotiate. A study, in fact, a 2019 study by Anti-Slavery International suggests that unions there are seen mostly as symbols, and actually they're seen as an extension of management. This has led to an increased risk of forced labor, child slavery in the area. So yes, human trafficking is rampant in Vietnam, but what is the government doing to stop it? Well, according to the US State Department, while the government of Vietnam has made significant efforts to curtail human trafficking in recent years, they have not taken adequate steps for its elimination. So here are some things that we think that they're doing right. Firstly, they've increased the prosecution of human traffickers in recent years. Secondly, they've started releasing specific disaggregated data on human trafficking cases. And finally, they've increased their victim assistance budgets so that they can conduct wide-scale awareness campaigns in vulnerable communities. That said, they did not meet all of the goals that the U.S. had set out for them. For example, there has not been an increase in efforts compared to the previous reporting period. Secondly, they have not implemented widespread identification programs. These are just protocols that allow people to search for clues that somebody could be being trafficked so that they can get the help that they need. And finally, they fail to identify vulnerable groups. So victims of human trafficking may have been charged for crimes that they were forced to commit. So to recap, we have discussed human trafficking in general, human trafficking in Vietnam specifically, and the government's response to it. All of this information is hard to interpret, so let's gather some context before making conclusions. Firstly, their main exports are manufactured goods. According to a 2018 article by VietnamBriefing.com, Vietnam is the clear leader in low-cost manufacturing in their area, and in fact, manufacturing accounts for 25% of Vietnam's GDP. $1 in $4 spent in Vietnam moves through the manufacturing industry, which means that just industry-wide violations can be felt countrywide by countless people. Secondly, I'd like to put their current level of development into perspective. There's been explosive growth in Vietnam since the 80s, and 45 million people have been lifted from poverty. Between 2002 and 2018, the national poverty rate fell from 70% to just under 6%. So now that we've put some context to all this information, we can start with three conclusions. First, workers in Vietnam are often abused and forced to work longer than many international groups deem humane. Secondly, this comes as no surprise. Vietnam is a developing country and it's under considerable stress from external forces like the US and Europe. And thirdly, as the nation of Vietnam has developed, so has its standard of living. They have been able to prioritize human trafficking, which shows a great amount of promise for the future. Thank you all, and I hope I've clarified the situation in Vietnam.
thank you for watching the McClung Speech Contest video. Your instructor will explain how you can gain credit for watching and for voting.